This is Christopher John Bjerknes. It is February 4th, 2023. Everybody is talking about the high-altitude balloons that China sent over the United States. People are calling for the government to shoot them down. I want to point out some very interesting parallels that exist between what China is doing with these balloons and has done with something else they sent over to the United States, and a story that was written and published by Jack London in 1910 called The Unparalleled Invasion. And China has made unparalleled invasions of the United States, which happened to parallel this story by flipping the script. London's story accurately predicted the rise of China as a superpower and the fact that the West and others would go to war with China. And he proposed in this story that the United States waged biological warfare on China by having small airplanes fly over China and drop glass tubes containing insects and other biological warfare carrying agents that dropped down onto Chinese cities and infected the Chinese with numerous plagues that ultimately completely wiped them out. So this story has been turned on its head, and the Chinese have invaded the sovereignty of the United States with their aircraft and other things in a way that mirrors and reverses this story that Jack London published in 1910. And it's also interesting to note what a Japanese military unit 731 did to the Chinese. It also somewhat mirrored this story of Jack London's, but it did it in the way consistent with Jack London's, in that the Japanese waged biological warfare on the Chinese from the skies. So what I'd like to do is read the most relevant portion of Jack London's story, The Unparalleled Invasion, excerpt from Walt Nervin's Certain Essays in History by Jack London. It was a futuristic story where he would have this as a report of this war that was waged between the Chinese superpower and essentially the rest of the world to wage genocide on the Chinese with biological agents dropped from the sky onto the Chinese that completely wiped them out. So the story goes as follows. After proposing that this war was set up, that the Chinese became very industrial, started to take over all the manufacturing and economy of the world, that the West resented this and set about to wage war on them. All the armies got together. The Chinese prepared their army. But a man in the U.S. came up with this idea of bombarding the Chinese from the sky with biological weapons. And here's a part of the story that describes that. But on May 1st, 1976, had the reader been in the imperial city of Peking with its population of 11 million, he would have witnessed a curious sight. He would have seen the streets filled with the chattering yellow populace, every queued head tilted back, every slant eye turned skyward, and high up in the blue he would have beheld a tiny dot of black, which he would have identified as an airplane. Very tellingly, in the United States, people now have their eyes turned skyward, and they see a giant balloon sent from the Chinese over the United States. From this aeroplane, as it curved its flight back and forth over the city, fell missiles, strange, harmless-looking missiles, tubes of fragile glass that shattered into thousands of fragments on the streets and housetops. But there was nothing deadly about these tubes of glass. Nothing happened. There were no explosions. It is true that several Chinese were killed by the tubes dropping on their heads from so enormous a height. But what were 3 Chinese against an excess birth rate of 20 millions? Earlier in the story, he talked about the fear that the Chinese were populating to such a great extent that they could eventually overwhelm the world with their masses. One tube struck perpendicularly in a fish pond in a garden and was not broken. It was dragged ashore by the master of the house. He did not dare to open it, but accompanied by his friends and surrounded by an ever-increasing crowd, he carried the mysterious tube to the magistrate of the district. The latter was a brave man. With all eyes upon him, he shattered the tube with a blow from his brass-bowled pipe. Nothing happened. Of those who were very near, 1 or 2 thought they saw some mosquitoes fly out. That was all. The crowd set up a great laugh and dispersed. The U.S. government seems hesitant to shoot down this Chinese balloon floating over American airspace. That may well be because it would be possible that within that balloon there are biological or radioactive elements which could be dispersed by shooting it down. That's a far greater danger than falling debris would be. And we have to be concerned about in the future, after this trial balloons have floated over the U.S., what they ultimately plan, because there is the danger that shooting these down could disperse agents, if agents have not already been dispersed by these balloons. As Peking was bombarded by glass tubes, so was all China. The tiny airplanes dispatched from the warships contained only 2 men each, and over all cities, towns, and villages they wheeled and curved, one man directing the ship, the other throwing the glass tubes. Had the reader been in Peking again 6 weeks later, he would have looked in vain for the 11 million inhabitants. Some of them he would have found, a few 100,000 perhaps, their carcasses festering in the houses and in the abandoned streets and piled high on the abandoned death wagons. But for the rest he would have had to seek along the highways and byways of the empire. And not all would he have found fleeing from plague-stricken Peking, for behind him, by hundreds of thousands of unburied corpses by the wayside, he could have marked their flight. As it was with Peking, so it was with all the cities, towns, and villages of the empire. The plague smote them all, nor was it 1 plague, nor 2 plagues. It was a score of plagues. Every virulent form of infectious death stalked through the land. Too late, the Chinese government apprehended the meaning of the colossal preparations, the marshaling of the world hosts, the flights of the tiny aeroplanes, and the rain of the tubes of glass. The proclamations of the government were in vain. They could not stop the 11 million plague-stricken wretches fleeing from the one city of Peking to spread disease through all the land. Sound familiar? Physicians and health officials died at their posts, and death, the all-conqueror, rode over the decrees of the emperor and Li Tang Feng. It rode over them as well, for Li Tang Feng died in the 2nd week, and the emperor, hidden away in the summer palace, died in the 4th week. Had there been but one plague, China might have coped with it. But from a score of plagues, no creature was immune. The man who escaped smallpox went down before scarlet fever. The man who was immune to yellow fever was carried away by cholera. And if he were immune to that too, the Black Death, which was the bubonic plague, swept him away. For it was these bacteria and germs and microbes and bacilli, cultured in the laboratories of the West, that had come down upon China in the rain of glass. See how the script has been flipped? All organization vanished. The government crumbled away. Decrees and proclamations were useless when the men who made them and signed them one moment were dead the next. Nor could the maddened millions, spurred on to flight by death, pause to heed anything. They fled from the cities to infect the country, and wherever they fled, they carried the plague with them. The hot summer was on. Jacobus Lanningdale had selected the time shrewdly, and the plague festered everywhere. Much is conjectured of what occurred, and much has been learned from the stories of the few survivors. The wretched creatures streamed across the empire in many-million flight. The vast armies that China had collected on her frontiers melted away. The farms were ravaged for food, and no more crops were planted, while the crops already in were left unattended and never came to harvest. The most remarkable thing, perhaps, was the flights. Many millions engaged in them, charging to the bounds of the empire, to be met and turned back by the gigantic armies of the West. The slaughter of the mad hosts on the boundaries was stupendous. Time and again the guarding line was drawn back 20 or 30 miles to escape the contagion of the multitudinous dead. Once the plague broke through and seized the German and Austrian soldiers who were guarding the borders of Turkestan. Preparations had been made for such a happening, and though 60,000 soldiers of Europe were carried off, the International Corps of Physicians isolated the contagion and dammed it back. Such was the unparalleled invasion of China. For that billion of people there was no hope. Pent in their vast and festering charnel house, all organization and cohesion lost, they could not but die. They could not escape. As they were flung back from their land frontiers, so they were flung back from the sea. 75,000 vessels patrolled the coasts. By day their smoking funnels dimmed the sea rim, and by night their flashing searchlights plowed the dark and harrowed it for the tiniest escaping junk. The attempts of the immense fleets of junks were pitiful. Not one ever got by the guarding sea hounds. Modern war machinery held back the disorganized mass of China, while the plague did the work. But old war was made a thing of laughter. Naught remained to him but patrol duty. China had laughed at war, and war she was getting, but it was ultra-modern war, 20th century war, the war of the scientist and the laboratory, the war of Jacobus Lanningdale. 100-ton guns were toys compared with the micro-organic projectiles hurled from the laboratories, the messengers of death, the destroying angels that stalked through the empire of a billion souls. During all the summer and fall of 1976, China was an inferno. There was no eluding the microscopic projectiles that sought out the remotest hiding places. The hundreds of millions of dead remained unburied, and the germs multiplied. And toward the last, millions died daily of starvation. Starvation weakened the victims and destroyed their natural defenses against the plague. Cannibalism, murder, and madness reigned, and so China perished. Not until the following February, in the coldest weather, were the first expeditions made. These expeditions were small, composed of scientists and bodies of troops, but they entered China from every side. In spite of the most elaborate precautions against infection, numbers of soldiers and a few of the physicians were stricken. But the exploration went bravely on. They found China devastated, a howling wilderness through which wandered bands of wild dogs and desperate bandits who had survived. All survivors were put to death wherever found, and then began the great task, the sanitation of China. 5 years and hundreds of millions of treasure were consumed, and then the world moved in, not in zones as was the idea of Baron Albrecht, but heterogeneously, according to the democratic American program. It was a vast and happy intermingling of nationalities that settled down in China in 1982 and the years that followed, a tremendous and successful experiment in cross-fertilization. We know today the splendid mechanical, intellectual, and artistic output that followed. It was in 1987, the Great Truce having been dissolved, that the ancient quarrel between France and Germany over Alsace and Lorraine recrudesced. The war cloud grew dark and threatening in April, and on April 17th, the Convention of Copenhagen was called. Representatives of the nations of the world being present, all nations solemnly pledged themselves never to use against one another the laboratory methods of warfare they had employed in the invasion of China. It appears that this script has been flipped by the Chinese onto the United States of America. And things may well get very much worse if our government continues to refuse to protect us from this aggression by the Chinese. The Chinese themselves were soon victims of an attack styled in the same way as Jack London's story. The Imperial Japanese waged biological warfare on the Chinese. The Japanese Unit 731, quote, used plague-infected fleas and flies covered with cholera to infect the population in China. The Japanese military dispersed insects by spraying them from low-flying airplanes and dropping ceramic bombs they had developed that were filled with mixtures containing insects and diseases that could affect humans, animals, and crops. Localized and deadly epidemics resulted, and an estimated 200 to 500,000 Chinese died of disease. These are things that we are forced to consider in our increasingly mad world. We need a government in place that actually defends the best interests of Americans. Neither Biden nor Trump has demonstrated any ability to do that. It is my personal hope that someone will step forward as an independent presidential candidate before it's too late and set about setting up American autarky, our industrial independence, defending us from our enemies in China, Russia, and North Korea instead of providing them with our technologies to be used against us, as the past Democratic and Republican presidents have consistently done for decades now. It was Gore and Clinton, protégés of Armand Hammer, who built up the Chinese nuclear program. Israel has assisted China with missile technology. friends Biden and Trump have both empowered the Chinese. Trump weakened our alliances in the Asian theater and sought about to subvert NATO. Biden is clearly allowing the Chinese to harm us in every way possible. We do need a government in place that will defend us from this ongoing attack. I am the author of several books. You can find my work at my website, CJB Books.com. Thank you, and bye for now.